Hey everybody, this is David from Landmark Park, and today we're out in Dale County, just east of Pinkard. I'm here with my good friend Charles Ziegler, who's a local historian, and he stumbled across a cemetery that's out off of County Road 9, and they call it the Old Judah Cemetery, but I'm going to let Charles tell you about how he discovered it, its original location where it was at, and how it got moved here.
Morning, my name is Charles Ziegler. I live in Newton, Alabama, and I've been asked to say a few words about this cemetery here. My involvement with this cemetery began in 2002 when the Dale County Historical Society were doing a cemetery book for the entire county, and I was one of the ones who came out here and surveyed this cemetery. And at the time, you can't see behind me, but the woods over there, you can see what it looks like now. That's what this cemetery looked like then. And we had to wade through the weeds and the briars and the bushes and get what we could. Then we went to the Dale County Courthouse and found other records of people who were buried out here, and that's how we come up with our census for this cemetery. This cemetery was moved here in 1942. It came from Fort Rooker in an area that we now know as Hanchy Field. And I had interviewed over the years several people who knew about this cemetery. They actually lived on Fort Rooker at the time frame that this cemetery was moved. And there are people still living today who have kinfolks out here that was moved off of Fort Rooker. In 1948, the Latter-day Saints Church come out. Excuse me, let me back up. In 1945, the Latter-day Saints come out and surveyed the cemetery, and it wasn't overgrown at that time, and they were able to read some of the headstones and some of the funeral home markers that were still left. In 1948, they came again, and at that time, they made a statement on their inventory that a lot of these markers were now beginning to be unreadable, but they put down what information they could just so somebody in the future might have a little something to go on. Well, as time fast forwarded, I was able to get hold of some architectural drawings where the cemetery was, how it was laid out when it was still on Fort Rooker, and the architectural maps of where they were placed when they came here. So between the two of it, that's how we wound up with the layout that we've got now.
So originally, what was the name of the cemetery?
Okay, the original cemetery was given, the land was donated by a Judah man, and the people referred to it as the Judah Cemetery. A few years later, they built a church on the same grounds, and they called it the Piney Grove Church. And I believe it was MES Church, Methodist Episcopal South. On the legal deeds, the deeds are made out to Piney Grove Church. The reason the sign says Old Judah Cemetery is because all of the old people that I interviewed affectionately referred to it as the Judah Cemetery, not the Piney Grove Cemetery. And even in the survey that the Latter-day Saints made in 1945, they also called it by both names. So out of respect for the elderly people that I surveyed and all of their memories, I put up the sign, Judah Cemetery.
Originally, what we refer to as Fort Rooker is where this cemetery was. About how far is it from where we're currently at was the original cemetery, and do you know when it was developed originally?
The way the bird flies, I would say it is no more than 5 miles. between 5 and 7. Now, if you go the road, you go 2, 4, 6, maybe 10 miles, road miles. And at that time, the roads were not paved, and there were different roads, and you have to look back at the old maps for that.
So it was moved so they could build Fort Rucker,
Yes.
which they started building that. Were there other cemeteries they relocated at?
Yes, on Fort Rucker there were a lot of cemeteries, and probably the biggest mass of locations went over to a church called Ebenezer. There are 5 cemeteries over there, and it's at an area, I believe they call it Long Street. But they've got all of them marked pretty well as having come off of Fort Rucker. And those were also surveyed by the Latter-day Saints Church.
All right, originally when the cemetery was relocated, how many graves were moved from where Camp Rucker is today?
From my count, it looks like there were about 140 people moved. And all of those were not in vaults either. The architect did mark who had vaults and who didn't. But since then, and the burials that have been added since then, we have about 160 burials all total out here today. This is Mr. James Gilley. He has been helping me a lot with this cemetery. Mr. Gilley does a lot of lawn mowing and weed eating up here in what I call the green side. And he's been a real big help to us. And we both concerned about in times to come when we're not able to do it, having someone to come and step in our place. Now, as we walk over here, this area that you're looking at right here is basically about where we started with the cleanup process. We come in right here because there was an opening, and then we just kind of branched out, went in, and then turned around and came back out on each side. And as we did that, you'll see these granite markers that are here. They were here when we got started. You'll see several vaults around. We got 1 vault, 2 vaults, a little headstone here. And way back in the back, you'll see a small headstone. And then over to your left, you'll see a tall headstone, and there's another couple of vaults back in there. And really, that's the only marked graves that we had to go on. All the crosses that you see are were put here after I laid it out, according to the architect's plans that we have available to us. Cut.
So when you laid it out, how did you confirm that there were actually graves there?
Ironically, as we were cleaning up, we would find those little metal funeral home markers. They were all over the place. And every time we'd find one, we'd just leave it right where it was at. We didn't want to disturb it for future reference. And then we started drawing out the measurements for each individual grave space. Just about every one of those markers were within 12 inches of everything that we laid out. Some of them we just left in place. Several of them we moved over a couple of inches to, well, like you'll see over here on this number 76. We would, if that metal marker was close to the cross, we just put them together.
So the metal crosses, the wooden crosses, those are what you made.
Yes.
And they all have numbers on them.
Those numbers are the same numbers assigned to them by the architect when they were moved from Fort Rucker to here. Same numbers.
So each number, we know who that person is, though.
Yes. Yes.
Is all this listed on the internet anywhere if somebody wanted to research this cemetery?
Yes, you go on to findagrave.com, look up Old Judah Cemetery, and you'll see a little bit of history on almost everybody, because there are several people across the southern United States that have been working on this project on the internet.
Charles said this is one of 3 original headstones that were relocated from where Fort Rucker is today to this current location back in 1942.
Okay, we're getting back to the grave of Dolly Mae Duncan. Dolly Mae died 26th of June, 1889. And I didn't think much about it at the time. I was just surprised that the marker and the cross were so close together. But someone had put me onto a story about Dolly Mae, and I went to the old newspapers and I found the history of it. It seems like at the time she had a husband and 2 kids, and her husband took a liking to a young lady in the community, and they started fraternizing each other, and they come up with an idea to poison Dolly Mae, and when she died they would get married. Well, little by little he was giving her some kind of medicine. I forget what the name of it was. He'd call it. And eventually Dolly Mae died. They immediately got married and they moved off to Florida. And when some of the neighbors found out about the story and all, they got to thinking, and they went to the coroner. The coroner exhumed her body. They confirmed that she did die of that poisoning. So they sent policemen down to Florida, wherever it was, got him, brought him back, took him to court, and convicted him of murder, and he was hanged on the public square in Ozark. And that is recorded in the Southern Star, if anybody wants to look it up. And it just amazed me that here she is, and I call it my cemetery, and we have this story, and it's a part of Dale County history. Now, the newspaper did say where he was taken to and be buried. I went to that church, that cemetery, and I ain't found no marked grave for him yet. But maybe one day we'll finish, as Paul Harvey would say, the rest of that story.
All right, Charles, if somebody is looking on Find a Grave and maybe wanted to research their family history, how would they locate the old Judah Cemetery?
I do not know what the GPS coordinates are, but the cemetery is at the intersection of Dale County Roads 9 and 55. 9 takes you to Newton, and 55 will take you to Pinker. The church across the road, what we old folks refer as Cattywampus across there, is Mount Hebron Methodist Church.